Good evening. Councilwoman Henley and Carolyn Smith from the Planning Department asked me to facilitate the first of the series with Bill Samler from Wakefield, who I am a partner with in working through emergency management. They decided that, well, if you're going to do one, you might as well do them all. So I'm back and you will see me again. But I do want to, before I introduce everybody, I want to put in a plug because as the emergency manager, always take an opportunity. September is National Preparedness Month. I have left the brand new hurricane guides in the back. Take 1, take 10. I don't want to take them back to the car. So please take a look at those. Give them out to families and friends. But think about that through National Preparedness Month. We'll be putting out a lot of information and reminders. So I really appreciate everybody being here. Our first speaker tonight is Brian van Eerden. He is the director of the Nature Conservancy Virginia Pinelands Program. In that role, he manages the Conservancy's land acquisition and forest management projects across southeastern Virginia. He received his master's degree in botany from the University of Georgia and his undergraduate degree in plant science from Pennsylvania State University. Please welcome him. There will be an opportunity after he speaks for questions before our next speaker comes up. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to be here. It's a great turnout. I want to say thank you to Mrs. Henley for inviting me here to give the opportunity to talk to you about the forests of Virginia Beach. Also want to thank Mrs. Henley for the tremendous advocacy work she does for the North Landing River watershed, an area that's really important to the Nature Conservancy, and just being an all-around great advocate for conservation. So thank you, Mrs. Henley, for all you do. And also want to say thanks to Chuck Payne. Chuck's the person who Chad and I interface with, and for the symposium that Mrs. Henley mentioned earlier. He's the sort of force behind making that symposium and tonight a success. So thank you, Chuck. So I'm going to talk about our forest here in Virginia Beach. So this is the second of 4 sessions, and this session follows on the first session, which was about learning the science behind sea level rise and coastal flooding in Virginia Beach. We all know what's happening. The water is coming in from the sea. That's reducing the capacity of our waterways and the ground and our infrastructure to handle stormwater. And as the water comes up, more and more people and more properties are being affected. I don't hear weather. I think that's bonus. So for this session, we're going to pivot and we're going to start thinking about solutions, identifying strategies to not completely solve the problem of coastal flooding, sea level rise, but finding some ways to use nature-based strategies to reduce the risk of flooding. And Virginia Beach is blessed with an abundance of green infrastructure. And some of the natural systems in Virginia Beach are or could be contributing to flood risk reduction. And as the city is pulling together a comprehensive flood management plan, we think it's really important to identify those natural systems that are contributing to flood risk reduction, to characterize the magnitude of those contributions that those systems are making, and then to identify how those systems can be managed or restored to maintain those functions and possibly to enhance them. So there's great infrastructure, there's green infrastructure, and we want to make sure that everything is doing the best job possible, and that includes our natural systems as well. Okay, so the The natural system that is in abundance here in Virginia Beach are forests, and I'm going to be talking about some of the work that the Nature Conservancy has done in forest conservation. We've been active in Virginia Beach for close to 30 years. We've helped protect 700-800 acres along the North Landing River. Very proud of that body of work. And we are confident that the land conservation work that we've done, as well as the state, our state partners and the city and others, is contributing to flood risk reduction in the city. It is and we think that forest conservation is a strategy that should be considered as a flood abatement, a flood risk reduction strategy when the city is taking a step back and looking at all the possible tools to address sea level rise and coastal flooding. So here's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk briefly about the interaction between trees and plants, or trees and water, I should say, and then provide an overview of the city's forests, and then make some comments on the state of the forest, particularly how it relates to coastal flooding, sea level rise, and then I'll end with some suggestions on forest conservation strategies. So we're going to talk about forests, and so just some basic points about what a forest means, what a forest is. Forest, of course, is more than just the trees. It's a system, plants, animals interacting with their environment, and very complex systems. Different forests provide different services. An upland pine forest, we're thinking about flooding, flood risk reduction. An upland pine forest is going to function differently than a bottomland hardwood cypress forest. And thirdly, a larger forest can provide more services and benefits than a smaller forest. Sort of an obvious point when we think about conservation, we have to have sort of large-scale outcomes to ensure lasting success of conservation. So really have to think about going to scale with forest conservation to have the outcomes that we're seeking. So forests provide all kinds of different services. We're going to touch on the first two there, flood storage and shoreline armoring. There's a long list of other benefits, and very difficult to put a price on all those services. The city has attempted to do that. This is a screenshot from the 2013 Urban Forest Management Plan, and the estimated annual economic benefit from the trees, from the city's tree canopy, is $250 million a year. So air quality, flood storage, energy savings, and really just a tremendous indication of the value that trees play here in Virginia Beach and wherever forests are. Okay, so a little bit about forests and hydrology, and we have some hydrologists here. I know one person in the back there who's got a lot of experience in forest hydrology, and so I'm going to oversimplify a lot of this, and there'll be some wincing among the folks who study forest hydrology. But to keep it at a high level, so forests are tremendous water managers, and they are part of the water cycle. We all remember the water cycle, and trees are at that interface that transfers atmospheric water into the ground, moves atmospheric water in the ground, and also moves groundwater up into the atmosphere. So really important sort of water handler. And if you look more specifically at what trees or what forests are doing on the ground, the trees and the roots of trees, they create pore space in the ground, really important for water infiltration. The litter on the forest floor obstructs flow, and so the flow path for water across the surface of land underneath the forest canopy is much slower. Trees, of course, will pull water up from the ground through their roots. They hold on to some of that water to grow. A live tree, half of its weight is typically is water, but a lot of the water, as it goes up to the leaves or needles for photosynthesis, a lot of that leaves as water vapor and goes up into the atmosphere. Depending on the species and the climate, that water loss through the canopy can be significant. Southern pine forests, of 70% of the water loss from the forest is through the canopy. So trees are tremendous water pumps. And the delta between the water that comes into a forest stand and what's lost through evapotranspiration and what goes into the tree is runoff. And there are three components to runoff. So it's excess water that the trees don't consume, doesn't go up into the atmosphere, surface runoff, subsurface flow, and then groundwater. And it's really the surface runoff and the subsurface flow that are of most interest to us when we're thinking about flooding. So number of factors influence how water moves out of a watershed. Again, this is oversimplification here, but two important points. One is the rate of surface water infiltration into the unsaturated zone. So in a forested situation, you have roots, a lot of pore space. That influences how quickly water gets into the ground, and also the structure, the physical structure of the soil, sandy soil versus clayey soil. That influences how fast water gets into and moves laterally through the unsaturated zone. And the other piece is how much volume there is in that unsaturated zone. So it's how fast the water moves in, it moves through that zone, and then how much of that zone is available. With sea level rise, of course, the groundwater is coming up, and the amount of unsaturated zone space is shrinking, and that's something that we really we can't control. What we can control, however, is what happens on the surface above the unsaturated zone. And that is a really important, difficult to see and characterize, but a really, really important part of the real estate of Virginia Beach. It's that flood storage, that water storage in that unsaturated zone. And the importance of forest cover for maintaining the ability for that unsaturated zone to serve as a sink of water is really profound. So this is an idealized diagram comparing the water budget for a setting where there's mostly forest cover here on the left, and then on the right, that same setting, all else being equal, with a largely developed landscape, 75% to 100% impervious surface area. And you see that there's a tremendous difference in the amount of water that's getting into the ground. So 50% of the water in the forested setting is getting into the ground, only 15% is getting into the ground in the other setting. And the difference is a lot more runoff. So how that translates in a storm event is captured in this idealized diagram right here. This is called a hydrograph. So this on the vertical axis, this is stream discharge. So this is the volume of water in a stream reach. And then on the horizontal axis, that's time. And so you're looking at the profile of water moving through a stream channel. The dotted line, dashed line, is a stream in a forested watershed. And then the solid line is an urbanized watershed. And you can see much different shape there. With the urbanized watershed, water hits the impervious surface, flashes out, gets to the stream, and you have a peak discharge very soon after the rainfall, as compared to the forested watershed, where that water has to move through the soil and it moves more slowly across the surface of the forest. So it's possible that under these two regimes right here, one might be an actual flood event where you have an overbank event and flood damage occurs to properties adjacent to a channel. And it might be that under all conditions being the same, that same rain event might not be a flood event if a watershed is forested. So that's one thing that forests are doing. They're aiding infiltration of water into that unsaturated zone. Another important role of forests is that they're pumps. So when you see a tree, think of a straw with the canopy sucking water up. And different species transpire different amounts depending on the setting of the soil. It can be excessive, it can be moderate, but in certain settings, an upland pine setting, for example, a tremendous amount of water leaves the forest floor by way of the canopy. And so what that's doing is that pumping is keeping the storage space of that unsaturated zone sort of available. So when you have a rain event, there's that much more pore space that's available to receive runoff during a rain event. So they sort of keep the unsaturated zone open and available. If you cut the trees down, the pump turns off, that water, all else being equal, that water's got nowhere to go. And you have, in this situation, there's not much of a topography. That water stacks up, sits on the ground. Some of it evaporates off, but some of it becomes surface water. And if there's a tilt to the land, that becomes runoff that goes into a stream. So when you cut a forest, again, there are a lot of variables involved here. This pumping effect might be more pronounced in an upland forest than, say, in a wetland forest, without getting too much into hydrology. But nonetheless, this diagram right here, just an idealized diagram on the vertical axis there, that's the groundwater level, average height of the groundwater in the summer, and then time on the horizontal axis. That arrow indicates clear-cut harvest, and you can see there's a spike in groundwater level. And that spike might take that water level over surface, so you have standing water. Over time, as the forest grows back, that evapotranspiration picks back up, and so it drops back. But during that period of time, when the water levels are elevated, that could create some complications, some challenges for the owners that surround that area that's been harvested. So a really subtle but perhaps important piece of the connection between forest condition and how much water is in somebody's backyard. And to make that point, we are in a robust forest market here in Southeast Virginia. There are a number of tracts in Virginia Beach that have very commercially valuable timber, and harvests do occur periodically. And last summer in the Lake Placid neighborhood, everybody's surprised, a logging truck rolled in and clear-cut 50 or so acres. And we don't know too much about the setting of this forest and the hydrology, but it's possible, I'm guessing, that the folks who are next door to this clear-cut next couple of years are going to have soggier backyards because, again, that water pump has been turned off. So the third thing I want to mention about the role of forests is shoreline and floodplain armoring. And so when we have storm surges coming up the North Landing River, West Neck Creek, having a forested floodplain, those trees they absorb and abate storm surge, so just a really important sort of physical role that they play there. And then most of our shoreline, because we have such a flat topography, most of our shoreline is far away from where the water line is right now, the channel is right now. But over time, as the waters, as there's more and more water and it spreads out, the future shoreline, sort of the edge of the valley wall, the topographic floodplain, having that area forested will be really important for maintaining the soil in that part of the landscape. So natural armoring. So a real quick overview: soil filtration, water pumping, and then shoreline protection. And this is, I'm going to go into detail in this spaghetti diagram right here. No, I'm not. I just want to say this, that this is really complex stuff, and I'm a botanist, not a hydrologist. And so again, for the forest hydrologists out there listening, I apologize. Okay, so that is a real brief overview, sort of how forests and water work. Now I want to talk about the condition of this wonderful forest that we have in Virginia Beach. So this is a snapshot from the urban forest management plan showing the cover types. You can see a lot of green there. Shows all the different dominant forest or land cover types: tree canopy, and then grass and shrub, and that's most of our agricultural land in the southern part of the city. And we have, so the total land area is 155,000 acres or so. 58,000 of that has trees on it. So the total tree canopy area is roughly 36%. of Virginia Beach, which is, I think, just remarkable. It's a very green city, something you should all be very proud of. And here are some obvious big forest blocks that I'm sure you all are familiar with. First Landing State Park and Sandbridge up to Oceana, and then Falls Cape State Park down there at the state line. And then the largest contiguous blocks are along the North Landing River, right along the border with Chesapeake, and then one of the headwater tributaries to North Landing River, West Neck Creek. And there's also a good bit of forest cover. Can't really call it a forest, but there's a lot of contiguous, mature tree cover in the more developed or older neighborhoods in the northern part of the city. And another interesting point here is that the percent tree canopy cover in the northern part of the city, the urban part of the city, is roughly the same amount as in the southern part of the city. The difference is where there's not a tree in the southern part of the city, there's agricultural land, and in the northern part of the city, it's mostly residential development or developed land. But a relatively even distribution of tree cover, total tree cover across those two areas. Okay, so forest types, two dominant forest types in the city, hardwood forest and then pine and pine hardwood forest systems. This is a panel on the left, Cypress gum or Cypress tupelo forest. This is the dominant forest type that you find along the rivers, low-lying areas, organic soils, regularly flooded. Cypress is just a remarkable tree. It's the redwood of the East. This tree grows to 2,000, 2,500 years. It can grow 12-foot, 15-foot diameter. Just a remarkable tree. Can tolerate a wide range of hydrologic conditions. You see it here in the upper right panel, growing in water. Trees cannot germinate in water. And what this represents is that tree established, that seedling that became that tree established when that was a shoreline. And so that shoreline has receded, and we don't know how long, but that tree has been growing in the water for a long time. So if you're trying to sort of plant a forest that can adapt to a landscape that's going to be flooded, cypress is just a tremendous species for that kind of a setting. And I'm so interested to go out and actually core this tree, because it might be one of these trees that's really small, but hundreds and hundreds of years old. The other forest hardwood type is a non-riverine hardwood forest, wet soils, poorly drained, and there are a mix of different hardwood species that occur there. Upland pine, historically, this was part of the longleaf pine belt. It's another part of my job is to try to bring back longleaf pine, one of the rarest forest types in Virginia and southeastern United States. A lot of that was converted to agricultural land, and so a lot of the pine land that we're seeing right now is early successional, abandoned farmland that's come back into pine forests. Interestingly, the largest pine forest that we have is a wetland pine forest called a pine pocosin. If you're on the Pungo Ferry Road crossing over the North Landing heading west, there's a large pine stand there, and that's a peat bog, and a really unusual forest type, particularly this far north. So this is a map showing the distribution of those forest types. In brick red there is hardwood forests, again, mostly cypress and tupelo, and that distribution that you're seeing reflects or where the water is. Those two, the pocosin, that pine pocosin habitat I was telling you about, right over here is Pungo Ferry Bridge. Those are right here. No, Pungo Ferry Bridge is, I'm sorry, it's down here. So that's where that big green pine forest is, and then there's also the maritime forest in Back Bay. One of the things you'll notice is that the big forest blocks are associated with the lower lying forested wetlands that we find along the North Landing River watershed. So here's the total forest cover. 23,000 or so acres is wetland, and 15 or close to 17,000 acres is upland. So if you're looking at broad brush stroke, where's the forest? Most of it is in wetland areas, which sort of makes sense because wetland areas are difficult to convert And so they're sort of forest because that's the highest and best use of that land. This is a map showing the distribution of that forest cover in relation to the waterways. So this is the National Hydrologic Data Layer, medium resolution. Again, you can see how much forest we have along the North Landing and also West Neck Creek. Interestingly, there is in the drainage divide, or one is not interesting, one of the obvious features that we see here is that in the drainage divide between the Lynnhaven River watershed and the North Landing, very little forest cover, so very flat area and very little forest cover. So from a water management perspective, very difficult or challenging environment for moving water. Another thing you'll notice is in here, a lot of waterways, very little forest cover, and also here along the west shore, west side of Back Bay. This is a map showing the elevation of the forest in the southern part of the city. So 0.91 meters is roughly 3 feet. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of forest that if the sea level rise models that we are looking at come to bear, 3 foot sea level rise, maybe in the next 50 years, a lot of that land that is forested right now will be underwater. And this brings us back to my comment about Cypress. The fate of that forest depends on the kind of forest species that are there right now. It could be that there will be a forest in that band between 0.91 meters, 3 foot down to sea level, if there's cypress out there. So one of the things that we want to do is get a better understanding of the composition, the species composition of these floodplain forests that are expected to be impacted by sea level rise. Another thing you'll notice is that, so dark green is the lowest band, and then you have this lighter color. There will be opportunities for forest migration, and so that's an important thing when we're thinking about sort of how the forest evolves over time. Is there a migration opportunity? Is there migration space? And we have that. And in some cases, we actually go up to the next band. This is around Stumpy Lake, so you've got a lot of low-lying land here, the next elevation band, and then all the way up to here on that's around Elbow Road. So anticipating sort of where the forest can go, we have to understand the species that are there right now, sort of the elevation gradient in front of those species, and what's the current land use. The other thing I'll point out is that the shoreline of right now, or close to the shoreline of Back Bay, there's a lot of forest cover. If we come up 3 feet, we're going to lose a lot of that, or there won't be that forest cover if nothing is done. So one of the things, sort of the visioning ideas we have is to think about where that 3 foot interval is going to be and try to establish flood tolerant forest vegetation to put in place what will become the future shoreline. And that could be a conservation lift for Back Bay as it moves landward as a result of sea level rise. This is a snapshot of conserved land. So everything in that orange color is forest land that is under conservation ownership. And approximately 50% of the forest that you have here in Virginia Beach is under conservation ownership, which is, I think, just remarkable. Most of the, so 57% of the wetland forest is under conservation. Not quite as much of the upland forest is under conservation, but really tremendous numbers up on the board here. And of the ownership that is under conservation, we have federal, local, TNC, state, and Virginia Outdoors Foundation. The big landowner, of course, is the federal government, Navy installations, and Back Bay, Falls Cape State Park, Princess Anne Wildlife Management Area in Back Bay, and Nature Conservancy lands. TNC lands are in purple there along the North Landing River. And what's not reflected in here is quite a bit of land that the city has purchased. I think there's a good bit of forest land on the east side southeast of Stumpy Lake. So taking a step back and looking at the forest conservation achievements in Virginia Beach. So there's 20,650 acres of forest land that's conserved in Virginia Beach. Again, that's just a knockout number. And that represents 50% of all forested land. If you put a very low bar, I think very low bar value on that land at $750 an acre just for the dirt, you're looking at something, an asset that's $15 million. If you had timber value on top of that, it would go well above that. So when you're thinking about that forest, a lot of different parties, all the ones that I just pointed to, have made investments in conserving that forest base, and it's a tremendous asset that the city has. And a lot of that land was protected for a variety of reasons, and I think for a lot of those purchases, we are meeting our primary objectives. So wildlife protection, recreation, aesthetics, water quality protection, maintaining the flight path between Oceana and Fentress. We're doing really well there. The question is, how are these acquisitions, how's all this forest conservation contributing to storm, surge, and protection and flood storage? And this is my snapshot sort of on the state of the forest in Virginia Beach in context to sea level rise. So again, we have a lot of forest. It's well positioned in some areas, particularly along the North Landing River, for storm surge abatement. So there's a lot of forest cover. There's opportunity for that forest cover to move as water levels rise, and that's a really important sort of forest and landscape attribute. And the land that is under conservation ownership is managed for old growth. So that forest is, if it's old, it's only going to get older, and if it's a young forest, it's just going to be managed as old growth. So there's real permanence in the sort of the structure of that forest. So all those contribute to how water moves through and across the land of Virginia Beach. One of the big challenges is that it's really hard stuff to measure. Quantifying the flood risk reduction value of an acre of forest is something that we're still trying to figure out. So that punch list of the first 3 bullets there, I wish I had some stronger metrics to report. But the fact is we don't have those metrics yet. And that's one of the things that we're working on with a lot of partners is measuring the flood risk reduction, the climate resiliency benefits of forest conservation. Some of the challenges that we have in Virginia Beach with regards to forest cover is that where there are a lot of residences and where there are smaller waterways, there's relatively little forest cover. So there's not a lot of sort of a natural system to work with in those settings. And it's difficult to predict the future of the forest on private land. So landowner may decide for very obvious reasons to take a forest that's doing a lot of hydrologic good, and the highest and best use might be cutting that timber and paying for Johnny's college education or covering healthcare costs. We don't have that certainty on private lands. And that's a challenge that we'll need to just think through. And then the other challenge is that low-lying forest is vulnerable to sea level rise. So we don't have a clear line of sight on the fate of those low-lying forests, but they will be impacted by changing hydrology. And the best thing we can do is to do a more robust assessment of the condition of those forests and anticipate sort of the direction that individual species will take when they're exposed to a changing hydrology. So winding down, sort of what are some opportunities sort of moving forward? So one of the things that I think is a real need here and elsewhere is to do a different kind of forest assessment. So we've done a lot of assessments looking at the biodiversity value, the recreational value of forest land. Given the urgency around flood risk reduction, and we know the role of forests in this area, I think there's a real case to be made for doing a hydrologic sort of function assessment of forest blocks in Virginia Beach. So that's looking at the flood storage value, the evapotranspiration potential, so the water pumping potential of forest blocks, shoreline armoring, and then evaluating these contributions stepping out into the future with different sea level rise scenarios. So getting the science right to inform where forest conservation can take place. And then the next piece is creating incentives for private landowners to conserve land. So it might be that the incentive is to sell, it might be the incentive is to sell timber rights or to place a restrictive or deed restrictions on the property. It might be that planting, doing afforestation, planting trees, but creating the incentives, financial incentives largely for private landowners to do conservation that will contribute to flood risk reduction. And then the other idea here is that, and this is sort of an idea that I mentioned with the west side of Back Bay, looking at where those migration opportunities are for forest vegetation, and making sure that in areas that will be impacted by rising water levels, that perhaps in that zone, avoiding future conflict with development and flooding, perhaps the highest and best use is to put in place a forest cover that is flood adapted. So pursuing those opportunities to establish future flood adapted forest communities. So one of my goals of this talk is to have, when everybody leaves, is to, when you're driving around, to look at a forest, look at a tree, and think about what that tree is doing to water, and what's it's doing to water as the water comes down into the ground. What is that tree doing to lift water out of the ground, and what are the trees doing to protect our floodplains and our shoreline? So if everybody has a little more awareness when they're driving around and looking at trees, looking at forests, that will be a success for me. And with that, I'd be happy to take any. I think we have a couple minutes for questions, or. And I get.
We're going to open the floor. Please make sure you use the microphone to ask the questions, because we are recording this so folks can see this later. So, are there any questions? Go ahead.
Can you speak a little bit more to shoreline armoring? I'm on the Lynn Haven. I've lost some trees recently because of erosion actually falling into the river, and I've got a couple more that are probably going to go. So shoreline armoring is an issue for me.
Right.
And what hardscaping, I'm told, is not the way to go. Living shoreline is actually going to take a lot of trees out. So can you speak to what we need to look at for shoreline armoring?
Ma'am, I'll be honest, I don't know too much about individual practices and species. There is a good bit of information out there, so living shoreline models, and I can point you to some of those resources if you'd like. I don't have individual species to recommend or tree establishment strategies to recommend. Sorry.
Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I wanted to comment to yours. I work with Lynn Haven River now. We have a program where we work with homeowners along the Lynn Haven River and also some of the other watersheds on living shorelines. Yeah, so they'll come out and they'll talk to you and they'll help you. So if you have a problem with losing trees or you want to know more about living shorelines, you can either see me afterwards and I can give you my card, or just go to our website and talk to them about our project that we have. Okay? Thank you.
I was curious if the city has considered enacting some type of ordinance, or whatever you want to call it, around Back Bay, similar to the CBPA, to protect the shoreline. One of the reasons Back Bay is experiencing a resurgence SAVs and what have you is because of the acquisitions of properties around it, so it slowed the development down somewhat. And I know for every rule of thumb, I think for about every mile of marsh, you reduce flooding by about a foot. So, to try to capitalize on that by minimizing the removal of forests and the sloping of the property. Everybody wants to harden their shoreline. I just want to know if that had been considered for Back Bay to try to protect that as well as like they've done for the Chesapeake Bay.
Great question. I'm not aware of. I will turn to folks from the city to see if there's been any discussion about having an ordinance or something like that for Back Bay, similar to what's been put in place for Chesapeake.
There is a southern rivers watershed buffer area, and so we do monitor that very similar to the way that we do with the Chesapeake Bay preservation area. So there is an ordinance in effect, and we do take steps to protect that buffer area as well. And certainly, anybody, if you have questions about it, you can contact us at the city, at the planning department. My name's Chuck Payne, and you can reach out to me.
Any other questions?
I have one, but I don't want to go to the mic. Can you go back to the slide that you had where the Nature Conservancy has all the land along North Landing River?
Sure.
I thought you owned a bunch of land along the west side of Back Bay also.
No.
You don't?
Nope. Sorry. No, that's the game department. Yep. So it's in red right here. These are wildlife management area units, and then all this is Back Bay Wildlife Refuge. Yep.
All right, anything else? Yes, ma'am.
We don't have, back in Back Bay and Pongo, we don't have a water table line that is very high, especially after all the rain we've had. What I wanted to know, though, is the stormwater management. What does it do? Because I don't have city water, and yet I get a bill every month, and all I can see is water coming up through the ground. What does it do?
So what I'm going to do is point you to Carolyn and Chuck back there for city-related questions, and see if we can't follow up. So before you leave tonight, let's check in with them. So any more questions for the topic that was just covered here? Yes, sir.
Do you have a model of what you would like to see if you could do it, or something that the city and the government and folks could aspire to, as far as a map and a plan of what we would really need to help protect us in the best method possible using vegetation?
Short answer is no. I keep saying no. I don't have this and all that. It's easy to say, these are the information needs that we have. There's a lot of science that needs to be done. Some basic science, particularly around the evapotranspiration potential, sort of figuring that part out to inform sort of the relative value of upland forest to sort of moving water out of the ground. So I think we need to have some more sort of foundational science knowledge before we can come up with a plan that would sort of prioritize which forest blocks are the most important. So I think we're moving in that direction, but I think it'll be some time before we have, again, the science to make some informed decisions about the most important blocks to conserve.
And a follow-up, I like the idea of you putting metrics on it to see what the value of it is to the citizenry, and also in controlling sea level infiltration. Thank you.
Alrighty, I'm going to close the Q&A session for Brian and move on to our next presentation. Before we do, I want to take an opportunity to welcome Mayor Jones is here as well to join us for this session, and we appreciate you supporting this. Everybody, a round of applause for Brian's. So Chad Boyce is from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. He serves the area south of the James River from Emporia to Virginia Beach and the Eastern Shore. His current research focuses on the restoration of the bass fishery and subaquatic vegetation in Back Bay. Before coming to the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, he worked for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries and the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. Let's welcome Chad.
Again, I want to echo Brian's comments and just express the thanks to Ms. Henley and all the city staff that have been involved in making these series happen, as well as the symposium that we were able to present earlier this year. I think the spreading of information is crucial here, and engaging the public and landowners and stakeholders is crucial to restoring what we hope to be a pristine system, specifically in terms of SAV, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Hopefully you're in a mood for a history lesson, because we're going to do some history today. It's a little bit less science than what Brian presented, but we're going to learn kind of where Back Bay was and where we are now, and maybe a little bit of where we're going. I'm going to use this mic because I probably will walk around a little bit, and if that's okay, then I'm just going to continue with that. So before we get started, I do want to acknowledge a few things, because I realize when you start talking about Back Bay, you can get very opinionated. And I will be the first to tell you that there's lots of strong local opinions when it comes to Back Bay, and I deal with them all the time. However, Back Bay does have an extremely dynamic history, and we need to get a glimpse of that. We need to understand where Back Bay came from as opposed to the Back Bay that we know now. But more importantly, when it comes to improving the system, especially SAV, you need to know that my goals are the same as your goals. My goal is an improvement of submerged aquatic vegetation coverage in Back Bay that will benefit duck hunters, that will benefit bass fishermen, that will possibly benefit floodwater storage within the system. But ultimately, my goal is the same as yours, and that's increase SAV throughout the bay. One other small note that I want to mention is we're going to talk about salinity tonight. And I'm sure there's folks in this room that have been familiar with or have even read some of the older management reports in Back Bay. Raise your hand if you don't mind. Just who's read some of the older management reports, the Sincock report, the Waterfield reports. All of those reports have made their way around the locale. And there's something that's interesting, is they're measuring salinity in something called percent sea strength. That is a somewhat of an obsolete term. We don't really use that today. We use parts per thousand. So just as a little clarification and maybe a lesson for you as you're reading those reports, just looking at percent sea strength, for example, let me get my pointer. Here, 5% sea strength. That is simply a calculation taking the percentage of sea strength, multiplying it by the percentage of the ocean, the parts per thousand salinity of the ocean, and that gives us parts per thousand. So you're going to hear me refer to parts per thousand. So you're going to hear numbers more like 1.7, 1.7, 3.4. You're going to hear those numbers versus a percentage. And just keep in mind that fresh water is 0 parts per thousand. Ocean water is roughly 34 parts per thousand. And currently the average salinity in Back Bay is somewhere around 1 to 2 parts per thousand. So we're dealing with a very, very fresh system. We're going to refer to it as brackish in some cases, but primarily we're dealing with a freshwater system. All right, we're going to start talking about the past. We've got to start with the past. I was showing Ms. Henley this picture earlier. It's remarkable. I'm assuming a World War II photograph, but it's just amazing to look at the western shoreline or the eastern shoreline of Back Bay, the marshes that existed, the points, all these areas that are commonly referred to now in maps and things, but they actually existed. It's remarkable how much this system has changed in the last decade or last half century. Very interesting picture. When we're talking about the past, we have to talk about salinity, because salinity has been one of the driving factors in Back Bay in terms of the diversity of submerged aquatic vegetation, in terms of the fisheries resources. So we're going to talk a little bit about salinity and show you some of the impacts that natural systems have had as well as man-made systems. So on the vertical axis, you'll see 0 at the bottom and max out at about 8. These are parts per thousand. Just remember we were referring to earlier, ocean water is 34 parts per thousand, fresh water is 0. So just looking at the timeline below on the horizontal axis, you'll see 1925, you see 1933. That was a major hurricane that hit this area. It was a 33 storm. You'll hear folks talk about it. They were not named at that point, so it was just called a storm. That raised salinity in Back Bay significantly. 35 storm, the same thing. 1962, the Ash Wednesday storm. I'm sure lots of people in this room probably remember that in detail. Massive salinity changes in Back Bay. For those of you that are not familiar, there was some artificial introduction of seawater into the system. In the 60s and 70s and early and mid 80s, there was artificial introduction of seawater through pumps, pumping at the Little Island pumping station. That raised salinity significantly, on average to 3 to 4 parts per thousand. And the map is not complete, but it really kind of serves its purpose, and that's just showing that it's a highly variable system. Rainfall, drought, tide, wind-driven tides, all of those affect the average salinity in Back Bay, which in turn affects a lot of other things. So just some early accounts. While we're talking about salinity, it's interesting to me to look at the early accounts. The earliest I could find was 1853. And the talk was, it was by an anonymous man named Forrest, or not anonymous, but a man named Forrest that didn't appear to have a title or anything. But he was talking about this Back Bay. He said it's very remarkable for extensive fishing, apparently greatest around the inlet. And then regarding the closing of Currituck Inlet, the freshening of the sound, saltwater fish disappeared and freshwater fish took their place. Currituck Inlet, I've never heard of such a thing. Another one in 1897, regarding again the closing of Currituck Inlet. Further, there were changes in vegetation that brought about countless thousands of ducks of species that had only been occasional before. So it's clearly something has happened that's changed the system, and it's revolving around this Currituck Inlet. Again, O'Connor in 29 says that there's been a steady progressive, I can't say that word because I'll probably mess it up. There's been a loss of the number of ducks in Back Bay since about 1920 because that's a decrease in duck food. So again, you're getting a glimpse here that this system is very dynamic. Things are changing. Some more early accounts. 1932, the water is extremely turbid and probably is a chief factor responsible for the destruction of submerged seed plants. I think we could say that in some of the current years that we've had in the system. I like this one. A Coast Guardsman in 1939 says, "I've seen the grass in the middle of Back Bay so thick that the yellow shanks walked across it the same as they're on dry land." Yellow shank is a yellowlegs, a shorebird that cannot swim very well. They typically walk on land, walk on the bottom. Like in 1944, there was considerable difficulty was had in clearing the boat propeller from sago pondweed, trying to get from the refuge headquarters over to Ragged Island. Fascinating to see these highs and lows and fluctuations in the system. And again, just not to continue, but Chamberlain, who was a major researcher in Back Bay in the 40s and 50s, said the waters are very turbid, and turbidity was a primary factor in limiting aquatic growth. What we're seeing now and what we've seen in the past is not new. Back Bay has experienced highs and lows in terms of SAV coverage. And it's important for us to realize that. So these inlets, this is a very cool map that shows Currituck Inlet, old and new. Did anyone realize that there used to be inlets into Back Bay? There were. Matter of fact, old Currituck Inlet was surveyed by William Byrd, one of the earlier surveyors in the North American region. And actually the separation between North Carolina and Virginia was actually the middle of Currituck Inlet. It wasn't a random line that was drawn. It was actually a line drawn through the middle of Currituck Inlet. You can see other inlets, Mosquito and Carthy's Inlet, also pronounced Caffey's Inlet. They've all been long closed. They were closed since the 1800s. The most recent was New Currituck Inlet, which closed around 1828, 1829. So that explains some of the earlier accounts that we saw, referring to closing of the inlet and freshening of the sound. We haven't had an open ocean inlet into the bay since 1929, but there has been frequent ocean overwash over the beaches and over the dunes. Currently, the closest inlet is Oregon Inlet, North Carolina. So that's a long boat ride if you're trying to get to the ocean. I tell folks in Sandbridge all the time, how do we get to the ocean? You better have a lot of gas. It's going to take you a while, but you can do it. All right, so we're going to briefly, I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this because it is a lot of words, but I want you to, again, just look at the trend and look at what we're going to see in the past. And we're going to start way back in the 1500s. There's actually accounts from the early explorers talking about visiting these inlets. It was primarily an open ocean inlet, and it was marine and brackish fish, very similar that you would see in somewhere like Oregon Inlet or Hatteras Inlet, primarily salt water. In 1829, we had the closing of Currituck Inlet. And there's lots of comments about an immediate freshening of the sound. And there's a lot of references to improved SAV growth, dramatic improvement of SAV growth. 1840s, 1900s, there was frequent ocean overwash. The dune, a natural ocean dune, is very low. It's only about a foot or so. The dunes that you see along the beach and along the shorelines now, they're all man-made. A natural ocean dune is literally about this tall. And the ocean can very easily wash over it and wash ocean water into the sound or into the bay. Again, in the 20s and 30s, relatively low SAV abundance, fish and waterfowl numbers decreasing a little bit, salinity is very low. Interesting. Overwash after the 33 storm, 1950 to 62, excellent SAV growth. A lot of the Hunt Club logs and diaries actually document this. They document this through the harvest of the ducks and geese, and they also make notes about grass and aquatic vegetation. 1962 was a very pivotal time in Back Bay because that was the Ash Wednesday storm. And that storm washed a tremendous amount of ocean water into the bay. I was not here. I did not see it. I'm sure some of you were around. Some of you may remember it. But salinities were measured to be as high as 26 parts per thousand around the actual breaches themselves. But on average, the bay was around 7 or 8 parts per thousand. The following year, it decreased back to 2 parts per thousand. So again, the bay is generally going to be in a fresh state. That's the natural tendency. There are a lot of references to initial SAV loss after the breach. A lot of grass died because salinity was very high. However, the same accounts refer to an increase in SAV growth in the following years, indicating perhaps a benefit from ocean overwash. So some historical maps of SAV it's really interesting, again, to get perspective. I think when we think of the glory days of Back Bay, we think of the entire bay being covered with grass, and everything was awesome. The fishing was great. The waterfowl hunting was great. But that's not the way the bay was all the way back in the 1800s and even the 1900s. And we actually have records of that. The dots here show different species of vegetation that are growing. That's the 20s, 29, same thing around Knott's Island. 46, you see grass up here in North Bay around the refuge. Same thing in 47. 56, something happened. That was a tremendous growth of grass. Native vegetation, which is very interesting. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Because, we'll continue with the timeline. And again, this goes back to after the 62 storm, the Ash Wednesday storm. There was a very prominent theory that ocean overwash was going to rejuvenate submerged aquatic vegetation growth in Back Bay. Because the year after the Ash Wednesday storm, there was a lot of SAV in Back Bay. I'm going to talk about that a little bit further in just a minute. 68 to 78, one of the highest recorded growths of grasses in the bay. That's the time period that most folks probably remember as being the bay literally covered by grass. Having boat lanes being cut by larger boats for smaller boats to be able to get through for fishing and hunting and whatnot. Eurasian water milfoil. Folks call it milfoil. It's actually an exotic species. First documented in 1966, probably there a few years before that, but first documented officially in 66. It's important for us to know that those earlier maps, remember the 1956 map which showed the entire bay covered with grasses? That was not Eurasian water milfoil, that was natural grasses. That was celery, that was the pond weeds, widgeon grass, the natural vegetation. It's not until 66 and later that we see milfoil showing up. All the references before 66 were probably not including milfoil. 78 to 87, that was really the glory days in terms of fishing. That was when Back Bay was producing hundreds of trophy largemouth bass per year. That was really phenomenal. That was probably nationally, Back Bay was ranked #1 bass fishery in the nation during that time, with a maximum of almost 250 citations caught in 1 year. I think the average number of citations in the state of Virginia now is a little under 300. So it's absolutely amazing. That's a bass weighing at least 8 pounds. So when it comes to salinity and SAV, this is where it could get a little tricky, but I want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page. I'm going to propose to you that it doesn't really show up the way it's supposed to, but 1 + 1 does not equal 2. In other words, it does not appear that high salinity equals high abundance and distribution of submerged aquatic vegetation. And here's why. Post 33, but before the 62 storm, salinities were low. SAV was moderate to low in abundance. 65, 87, that was saltwater pumping. The bay's salinity was being increased significantly, much higher than it would naturally occur. 1966, we have milfoil entering the bay and saltwater pumping still continuing. 68 to 78 is when it explodes, takes off. Salinity is generally a little bit higher during those periods. But something happened in 78, 79 where the grass started to die. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for Back Bay in its glory days. In 87, saltwater pumping ceased. Salinity was still fairly high, but SAV was low as it's been in 30 or maybe even 40 years. Something happened. Quickly, additional notes on milfoil. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I want us to have a proper perspective of where we want to go. And the reason I say that is because 1966 marks the introduction of milfoil. Seeds could have come over, they could have overwashed during a storm event. They could have been brought in through saltwater pumping. They could have come in on the boat trailer from a bass fisherman. We have no idea how they got here, but they were not native to this area and they were brought here somehow. But what we see is not an uncommon behavior of an exotic species when they first become established. And what we see here is you document a presence that generally is followed by an explosion of growth and distribution. That ends up turning into rapid colonization of a watershed or whatever it may be by fragmentation and seed dispersal. And then that growth is generally followed by some sort of an equalized die-off or the species reaching an equilibrium with its environment. We see that a lot in other animals, which we won't go into, but it's not an uncommon situation to see milfoil, for example, show up, take over the entire bay, and then die off in a short period of time, relatively short period of time. That was just a side note, just for your viewing pleasure. Some documents that refer to Back Bay during the glory days. This is 1980, interesting. This was 1979. I think 78, I believe. I saw, yep, 78. I've always liked the reference to a bass hole. I thought that was pretty good. Back Bay is state's top bass hole. But this picture is really cool. Aside from the half-naked man, if you look in the background, you can see the water is absolutely covered with SAV. And I can tell you that having seen this before, I know what that is, and that's Eurasian water milfoil. It's the only plant that typically sends up these shoots above the top of the water surface that they use to pollinate. And it's interesting, and I actually know exactly where this is, and folks that are familiar with Back Bay should know exactly where that is as well. That's just on the southwest side of Ragged Island. That's the little clump of trees where the Ragged Island Clubhouse used to be. So just continuing with our timeline, unfortunately that was the 80s were the end of the fishery. That was where the fishery collapsed. SAV was pretty much eliminated, and literally a big mud hole was a quote used in lots and lots of documents referring to Back Bay. Definitely not the glory days. And that left us in the classic catch-22. The turbidity was very high because there was no grass to capture sediment. There was no grass growing because the turbidity was very high. It wouldn't allow light penetration into the water column. So this was where we were up until the mid to, or the early 2000s, stuck in this catch-22. Before we continue, I'm just going to continue with the bass discussion here. It's interesting, you see this peak. Again, these are numbers of citation fish, trophy fish, overlaid with the year. And it's really cool until you do this and you overlay the submerged aquatic vegetation distribution over top of the bass citation data. And what you see is that even though the bass fishery was peaking, we were already in a decline with the grasses. Something was already happening and the grasses were already beginning to go, even though the fishery was exploding. Just for interest, these peaks, the reason they're there is because grass was steadily decreasing. And what was happening is these fish are being concentrated in smaller pockets of grasses, so they were more easily susceptible. The anglers could find the fish easier. Once they found the grasses, they could capitalize. It wasn't that the fish were doing really, really good. It was the fact that they were being forced into smaller and smaller habitat, which is interesting. When we think of the glory days of Back Bay, we don't really know that. We don't really keep that in mind, that the system was already degrading in terms of grass abundance. So some notes on SAV. This is an anonymous letter that was in the Sincock report. And I've actually got that report with me today. It was 1965. It was the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, probably one of the most comprehensive studies done on Back Bay. It was the Currituck Back Bay study. I'd be glad to show you how to find it, how to get copies of it, but it's really a tremendous amount of data. But there's a reference here to flood, and it says people in this area have always been bothered occasionally by high water. Even 25 to 50 years ago, if you do the math, it takes you back to 1899, 1874. But the water did not do so much damage because the waters did not stay as high as long. The interesting part of that is we can very easily overlay those dates with what we know in terms of anecdotal reports of grass abundance. Grass was very high during that time period. Something was going on that was allowing the bay to control floodwaters and not suffer the impacts that we're seeing today. More than likely, it was submerged aquatic vegetation. I've talked to many of the old timers, and they refer to the days when the grass was high, the bay's elevation did not move as much. It would take a lot longer period of blowing of hard north wind, hard south wind to get the effects that we see now. Again, that's the idea of friction created by grasses. The grasses are creating friction when water is trying to flow through, at least to a certain point, until the floodwaters get much higher. The grasses are actually able to retard floodwaters. They're holding it back, they're slowing it down, like pouring water through a sponge, I think would be a good analogy. And this points to the fact that SAV density is affecting water flow in some ways. And likely that higher densities of SAV is retarding water flow, reduces the amplitude, or if you recall Brian's map of the floodwaters in an urbanized area versus floodwaters in a forested area, the high peak would be the amplitude. That's the high part of that wave. That would be reduced. And again, that kind of the same impact here. Forested area versus SAV would really have the same impact in terms of floodwater reduction. or impacts. So I think what we can say here is that more SAV means less wave action. Less waves mean less marsh island erosion. And loss of marsh islands allow floodwaters to flow with less resistance. I think that's a pretty somewhat obvious fact if you've been out on Back Bay. If you think all the way back to the slide I showed you with the airplane and how large those marshes were and how complex those marshes were compared to what's there now, a lot of the points have eroded, the coves are gone, they've been washed. So if something is happening that's allowing these floodwaters to have more of an impact in the system than they have. Obviously, sea level rise comes into play, but the system is degraded as well. I don't think anyone here can deny that SAV is important in the system. I purposely tonight, I want to leave you hanging a little bit. I want you wanting more because I can't present everything at one time. What I wanted to give you was an introduction as to where Back Bay specifically was and the direction that it's going. There's a tremendous amount of work being done by local researchers as well as academia in terms of looking at the system, and I think SAV and floodwater mitigation is definitely something that needs to be high on the list. There is an impact there that whether or not it can be quantified, I don't know, but it certainly is an impact. And we're just in summary here, just referring to grasses in the bay. It obviously improves water quality, it traps sediment. If you've ever been in a highly vegetated area, you see how clear the water is. Sediment reduction is huge, allows better light penetration. Waterfowl, obviously high years of SAV in the bay attribute to high numbers of ducks and geese. Same thing with habitat for fish. And then again, the benefits to floodwater mitigation. And obviously there is an impact there that we may or may not have the full knowledge of, but certainly is an impact. And with that, I'm gonna take questions because I wanted to leave time for questions, but I also want you thinking there's got to be something more to this, and there's got to be the next step. And I'd love to be able to present again at some point and maybe talk about other options. But it's just a tremendous amount of data to try to cover in a short period of time.
Okay. Questions? Go ahead.
While he's walking up, I'll tell you, this is actually a fishing tournament from Back Bay from the early 60s. You can see these are all largemouth bass. And just for perspective, this is one club, one tournament, one day. I wonder where all the bass went. We just can't figure it out. Yes, sir.
So my question is of more importance on how do we get that SAV level high again so we can keep that water level lower and keep those floodwaters from coming into Back Bay, Pungo, and flooding all those folks. And then the second question is, I love bass fishing, so it's a great thing to have those bass there. But how do we get that SAV level high again to create that grass?
And that is the million-dollar question. There are some studies being done looking at literature research revolving conditions best we can figure that contributed to higher SAV distribution in the bay. I've done some work myself using floating turbidity curtains in the bay, using that as a way to model the impact of grasses and sediment transport. But the bottom line is we don't know. There is certainly a link in Back Bay with higher grass abundance and lower rainfall in the spring. There's certainly a link there. When we have had drought conditions, when we've had very, very dry spring weather, we have had very good growths of SAV. Rain dance, perhaps. Maybe stop doing the rain dance, and maybe that'll help it.
If I could give a follow-up question, how can we help?
That's probably the $500,000 question. I've had folks ask, what can we do to help? And monitoring is tremendous. even if it's anecdotal reports from people calling to say, hey, we're not seeing any grass in where we normally see it. Or, hey, look, we're seeing a ton of celery in this area, and we typically don't see it there. All of those reports help to put the puzzle together. But the bottom line is, I think if we knew what the answer was, we could probably try to fix it. But Back Bay being open, being dynamic, being such a large water body, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what's causing these high and low fluctuations. I'm like Brian, I don't really have the answer. I can. But thank you.
Other questions?
The question about what we can do, are there any best practices for landowners, such as not spraying the ditches with herbicides so that the water's not running so fast, creating so much turbidity and that type of thing, that should be put into practice to help, especially for those of us where our runoff goes right into Back Bay?
Without a doubt, shorelines that are vegetated result in less erosion than shorelines that are non-vegetated. When I'm speaking with private pond owners and they're having problems with sediment, high sediment loading in their ponds, one of the first things I recommend to them is increasing the buffer around their ponds and allowing that buffer to return to natural state, at least to grasses. The problem with that is, in your case and a lot of other cases, letting grass grow is very difficult for folks. Letting grass grow and not having a neat and tidy ditch or a neat and tidy yard is difficult. In Back Bay, it could be, even somewhat dangerous with snakes and whatnot. But certainly, yes, having vegetation in place to reduce sediment runoff is a benefit. That's a small local way that you can contribute. The problem with that is the city probably has other principles in play to help improve drainage and to help improve floodwaters to recede. And it's a hard mix to really to try to come up with a solution. And I think honestly the answer is Back Bay's problem is much larger and much more on an environmental scale than it is on a localized scale. Because the same years we see high SAV abundance in Back Bay, we generally see it in other areas as well. So something is typically going on a larger scale that impacts the system, which I think drought probably plays into that significantly. Not that we want drought, but it certainly reduces runoff and sedimentation.
Any other questions for Chad? Okay.
I'd like some fishing questions.
So if I heard you right, the SAV that led to this great fishery of the 80s was an invasive SAV?
That is correct.
All right, so as a non-ecologist, can you explain the difference between the invasive Phragmites issue now and the invasive SAV of the past? It was a good thing.
Okay, yeah. Well, obviously the big explanation there is SAV is submerged and under the water. So it's never going to grow on any sort of a dry land. It has to be covered in water for its entire life. And Phragmites has a unique ability to grow in the water as well as above the water and on dry land. The effects of Phragmites could be argued in Back Bay because Phragmites, unfortunately, it's referred to as a noxious weed, but it does a very good job at keeping shorelines in place. So some of the marsh islands that we have in the bay, they could have been further exacerbated. The losses could be even higher had Phragmites not been there. That's one of the hard pills to swallow. Is this exotic species helping us or is it hurting us? I don't know how to quantify the answer about Phragmites, but I can tell you that in this day, Eurasian water milfoil, although it being an exotic species, to me is still desirable because it serves a purpose in the system of reducing wave action and improving water clarity. Is that
Yeah,
help a little bit?
and I'm going to look around. That was purely informational for me. But the second question related to turbidity, we had a little discussion back here, was also I saw that turbidity was an issue pre-development. So kind of the turbidity we see today or even in the past, the question is it terrestrial derived or is it marine derived?
That's a great question. And by and large, I would probably argue that most of the turbidity we see in Back Bay is made up of resuspended organic matter that's on the bottom of the bay. And it's resuspended during high wind events. There's a surface to bottom mixing in a lot of Back Bay where it's shallow enough for a wave can break and a wave's height can only be maximum of half the depth of the water. So a 1 foot wave can break in like 2.5 feet of water. So when you have shallow water and high wind, you have this mixing that occurs and it's constantly churning the bottom. If you've been out there, you've seen it. However, there are cases where we can point to specific places and say, yes, there was a significant amount of shoreline erosion coming from maybe a sore subject, but Lake Tecumseh, Brinson's Inlet Lake, there was a tremendous amount of turbidity coming out of that lake on every north wind event. And when the weir was installed in Lake Tecumseh, that turbidity ceased coming out of Hells Point Creek, and within the first year, there were grasses showing up in North Bay that hadn't been there in a long, long time. That was a direct impact. So I think in Back Bay, I think the issue there is probably fetch. There's long expanses of water that the waves can build and just constantly churn and resuspend that organic matter.
Give a round of applause for Chad. Great presentations this evening. I learned quite a bit about Back Bay. I grew up in Kempsville, so Back Bay for us was always way far away. Great information tonight. I want to remind everybody that this is the second in the series, and there's 2 more to go. Let me pull up that slide here for you. So we've got 2 more coming up, and you get to see my bright, shiny face, too. But September 5th and September 19th. And be aware that the one on September 5th is actually during the day. To offer another opportunity for folks. All of these presentations are on the website and available. And again, we are filming this, so folks can take a look if they want to share what a great presentation they saw tonight. There's an opportunity for everybody else to see. I want to thank everybody for coming out. Yes?
Just be aware that the one at the Senior Resource Center on the 5th will be at 10:30, not 9 a.m. But if you come, you get to see the wonderful Senior Resource Center in addition to seeing a great presentation. Yes. And we have a covered dish lunch.
Get food with that one, so that's always good. I want to thank you all for the long hike here, and gather your strength as you hike back out to your cars. But thank you again for this evening.